you came back again. I confess I find that gratifying. Not because I doubted you, no. I have learned over the course of our time together that you are precisely the kind of person who comes back, who sits down in the dark, turns the volume up, and leans in rather than away, who has heard what lives in abandoned houses and unmapped forests and the slow rot of neglected theatres, and has decided quite deliberately that they would like to hear more. There is a word for that quality, several words in fact. Brave is one of them. Foolhardy is another. I leave it to you to determine which applies. Tonight I have 3 more accounts, each one concerning a different variety of darkness. The darkness of deep places, of stone and water, and the things that dwell where light has never reached. The darkness of obsession, of a mind that filled every surface until the surfaces filled back. And the darkness of the stage, of a man who gave himself so completely to his art that the boundary between the two simply ceased to exist. 3 stories, 3 lights going out. You know what to do. You have always known what to do. Keep your flashlight close. There is a particular arrogance to the explorer. Not the malicious kind, something almost admirable in it, truth be told. The arrogance of the person who looks at a locked door and sees not a warning, but an invitation. Who looks at a flooded cave extending into geological darkness and thinks, quite sincerely, that the correct response is to put on a wetsuit and go in. Marcus Hale had been cave diving for 14 years, certified to depths most divers would find difficult to comprehend. Trained to navigate flooded passages by touch and instrument alone, in conditions where a single miscalculation means the difference between surfacing and not. He had mapped passages no human had entered before him. He was, in the vocabulary of his community, one of the best. Which makes what happened in the Coldwell system all the more instructive. The Coldwell Cave network sits beneath a limestone plateau in a county that does not advertise its attractions. A surface entrance, unremarkable, partially obscured by bracken, drops via a short climb into a dry antechamber, and from there into a flooded passage system extending, as far as survey data suggests, for approximately 4 miles in 3 directions. As far as survey data suggests, because the operative fact about the Coldwell system, the fact that Marcus Hale knew and documented and ultimately disregarded, is that it has never been fully mapped. Things have prevented this. Equipment failures mostly. Divers who turned back at inexplicable moments, reporting a sudden and overwhelming certainty that they were not alone. A smell that did not belong to limestone or still water. A sound, low, rhythmic, sourceless, felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. Marcus had read all of these accounts. He had filed them, with the clinical efficiency of the experienced explorer, under psychological phenomena consistent with nitrogen narcosis and enclosed space anxiety. He entered the system on a Thursday morning in late March. Alone, inadvisable, as every subsequent account has noted. His equipment included redundant light sources, a dive computer, a guideline reel, and a body camera mounted to his helmet. Standard configuration, methodical, prepared. The footage recovered from that camera runs to 41 minutes. The first 30 are unremarkable by any standard. Marcus moves through flooded passages with the fluid economy of the deeply experienced. Deliberate, breathing measured, the guideline paying out behind him in a pale thread, connecting him to the world above. At the 23rd minute, he surfaces into an air pocket, a submerged grotto, ceiling rising 8 feet above the waterline, walls close and glistening with moisture. He removes his regulator, speaks to the camera, as solo divers do, a form of documentation and perhaps company. Air pocket, approximately 20 meters from the main passage. Ceiling stable, no visible extensions. stopping to rest. He rests. The silence is absolute. The particular silence of underground spaces, which is not merely the absence of sound but something denser, more deliberate, as though the stone itself is listening. At the 31st minute, Marcus turns his head. The camera turns with him. The beam sweeps across the far wall, and in the far corner, at the edge of the light, where the shadows are thickest and the ceiling meets the floor in a narrow angle, something moves. Not water dripping, not a trick of refraction. Something low to the ground, shifting its weight with slow, considered deliberateness. The movement of a thing that has been still for a very long time and has chosen now to be still no longer. Marcus does not appear to see it. His head does not turn further. He continues speaking, unhurried, professional, about the limestone formations above him. His voice is perfectly steady. His breathing is perfectly steady. At the 37th minute, the footage ends. Not cuts, ends. The camera recorded 4 more minutes of absolute darkness before the battery failed. In those 4 minutes, the audio contains only 2 sounds. The first is something moving across wet stone, growing closer. The second is Marcus Hale's breathing, steady, unchanged, utterly untroubled. As though he did not hear it coming. As though perhaps, by that point, he did not need to. The camera was recovered 11 days later at the base of the entrance shaft, placed there, carefully, upright, facing the entrance, as though whatever left it there wished to ensure it would be found. Marcus Hale has not been recovered. The Coldwell system remains open. No one has gone back in. And so the Coldwell system waits, as it has always waited, as it will continue to wait, with that particular geological patience of deep places that have existed in darkness for longer than anything living has existed at all. Marcus Hale went in. The camera came out. The mathematics of that exchange are, I think, sufficiently clear. There is perhaps a grim comfort in a horror of that nature. A cave is a cave. The dark beneath the earth is at least honestly dark. It makes no pretense of being otherwise. It does not invite you in with warmth or familiarity. It simply sits there, in the cold, in the wet, in the silence, and waits for the foolhardy to arrive of their own accord. How entirely unlike our second story. Our second story concerns a kitchen, a domestic space, a room associated in the minds of most with warmth and routine and the small, reliable comforts of ordinary life. A room that should have been the most familiar thing in the world to a man clearing out the belongings of a distant relative. And yet, familiarity, as it turns out, can be the most insidious horror of all. Because it is in familiar places, in the rooms where we lower our guard, in the spaces we do not think to examine too closely, that the walls have the most time to watch us, and to paint what they see. The second account. Horror vacui. Art history encompasses an enduring term. Horror vacui. The fear of empty space. The compulsion found in certain works and certain minds to fill every available surface with pattern, with image, with mark, to leave no void, no silence, no gap through which the void might look back. It is found in the art of certain cultures, in the notebooks of certain obsessives, in the work of those for whom the blank surface is not a beginning, but a threat. It is considered by most scholars an aesthetic tendency, a stylistic choice. Most scholars have not been to the house on Greve Street. Thomas Aldrich drove there on a wet Wednesday in November, 3 hours from the city, through countryside that grew incrementally less familiar the further he went. The house had belonged to his great-uncle Edmund, whom Thomas had met precisely twice in his life, and who had died at the age of 81, leaving no closer heir. The solicitor's letter had been brief and practical. There was a house, there were contents, someone needed to assess and clear them. Thomas, being the nearest available relation, was that someone. He had no particular feelings about Edmund. One cannot grieve a stranger, even a stranger who shares one's blood. He arrived with a notepad and the brisk efficiency of a man who expects to spend 2 days cataloguing furniture and be home by Friday. The kitchen stopped him entirely. Every surface had been painted. Every surface. Walls, ceiling, cabinet doors, the tiles behind the sink, the underside of the shelves, the inside faces of the cupboard doors. Floor to ceiling, edge to edge, corner to corner, without a single centimetre left bare. Painted in a dark brownish pigment, something between umber and black, in patterns of extraordinary intricacy. Spirals and whirls and curling, branching forms that the eye followed helplessly from one surface to the next. And faces, embedded in the patterns, emerging from the spirals like faces emerging from cloud, visible only when the brain agreed to stop resisting what it was seeing. Dozens of faces, perhaps hundreds. Thomas documented methodically, wall by wall. Professional distance, a useful thing when the mind is not prepared to process what it sees. It was at the 5th photograph that he saw it. A face more precisely rendered than the others, recently painted, pigment slightly darker, lines crisper. A face he recognized. His mother's face. His mother who had never met Edmund, who had no connection to this house, this man, these walls. He told himself it was coincidence. Pareidolia, the brain finding the familiar in the abstract. He returned to his documentation. He worked efficiently. And as the afternoon became evening and the shadows in the kitchen deepened and shifted, he began to see others. His father, his sister, his own face, 3 times in 3 corners at 3 different scales, as though observed from 3 different distances, as though Edmund had stood in this kitchen and watched, through some impossible window, the heir he had never met approaching, and had painted what he saw over and over with meticulous and devoted attention until the walls ran out of space. Thomas slept in the car that night. In the morning he went back inside. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. He looked at the walls, and the walls, patient and absolute and utterly without mercy, looked back. He is still there, in a sense. A cousin arrived 6 months later to begin the same process. She stood in the doorway. She raised her phone to photograph the walls, and stopped, because among the hundreds of faces, she saw one she recognized, a man she had never met in person, a face known only from a photograph in the solicitor's file. Thomas Aldrich, looking out from the wall with the same fixed, patient attention as all the others, rendered in slightly darker pigment, slightly crisper lines, as though painted more recently than the rest. The house remains, the walls remain, and somewhere in the density of pattern there is a space, small, deliberate, where the pigment is fresh and the surface has not yet been filled. It is waiting. 2 stories now. A cave that keeps what enters it, a house that paints what approaches it. 2 entirely different darknesses. And yet, listener, if you have been paying attention, you may have noticed something they share. Patience. That is the quality above all others that distinguishes the truly terrible from the merely frightening. The truly terrible does not rush. It does not lunge. It does not announce itself with screams and sudden violence. It simply accumulates, quietly, over years, over decades, over 31 years of a man alone on a stage, performing every role, wearing every face, filling every silence with voices that were in the end all his own. Or were they? Our third and final story tonight is, in some respects, the gentlest of the 3. No cave, no darkness underground, no walls closing in with their patient, painted faces. Only a theatre, an old one, the kind that smells of dust and velvet and the accumulated breath of every audience that ever sat in it, the kind that holds its history in its bones. And a question, a simple, quiet, deeply unsettling question. When a man devotes 31 years to becoming his characters, at what point do the characters become him? The third and final account, the full house. Allow me to tell you about devotion. Not the mild, manageable kind. Not the devotion of the hobbyist or the enthusiast. The other kind. The total kind. The kind that does not distinguish between the self and the work. The kind that, given sufficient time and sufficient darkness, begins to blur the line between creator and creation, until the line is not blurred but simply gone. Victor Crane had run the Aldwych Theatre alone for 31 years. He wrote every production himself, designed every set, built every piece of scenery with his own hands, sewed every costume, and performed every role, every character, every voice, every body, himself. Alone on the stage in an empty auditorium, performing plays of considerable complexity to seats that were rarely occupied. Those few who attended described the experience in contradictory terms. Mesmerizing, some said. Deeply unsettling, said others. One reviewer wrote 3 paragraphs his editor declined to publish, describing it as watching a man come apart at the seams, voluntarily and with great artistry, before an audience that did not fully understand what they were witnessing. Victor died in February, quietly. In the theatre, naturally, in his chair in the wings, surrounded by 31 years of costumes. The masks hanging in their rows along the back wall. The painted faces of 100 invented souls, watching their inventor make his final exit. A new director was appointed, Claire Marsh, young, ambitious, entirely unfamiliar with the theatre's history beyond what the acquisition documents contained. She arrived on a Monday morning in April with a set of keys and the particular energy of someone who intends to make something of a neglected space. She heard the rehearsal before she reached the door. Voices, multiple, overlapping, the cadences of rehearsed dialogue. The sound of a production in progress. She assumed, reasonably, that someone had let themselves in. She unlocked the entrance, walked down the aisle toward the stage. The auditorium was full, every seat occupied, every face turned toward the stage, pale, smooth, identical in the dim light. Masks, white, expressionless theatrical masks, hundreds of them, sitting with the absolute stillness of an audience that has been waiting a very long time for the performance to begin. On the stage, figures, costumed, masked, moving through blocking with practiced precision. A production in full rehearsal. Voices performing lines from a play Claire had never read, in a style she recognized from nowhere, telling a story she did not understand but could not look away from. She walked to the lighting board and brought up the house lights. The auditorium was empty, every seat bare, the stage bare, the costumes on their rails at the back, the masks on their hooks along the wall, hanging in rows, motionless, the expressions of 31 years of characters never played by anyone but the man who made them. Silence. Claire is not a person given to superstition. She believes in acoustics and imagination, and the tendency of old buildings to produce sounds the newcomer interprets as occupied. She applied these explanations with considerable determination. She believes all of this. But she has not opened the theatre to the public in the 4 months since her appointment. She works there in daylight only. She does not touch the costumes. She does not go near the stage after dark. And the masks, the rows and rows of white, expressionless masks, she has left precisely where they are. Because there are more of them than there were when she arrived. Not many more, a dozen perhaps, hanging at the end of rows where the hooks were empty on her first day. White, expressionless, slightly worn at the edges, except that the paint is fresh, the elastic at the back unworn, made recently, hung in the dark while the theatre was locked and Claire was elsewhere, by someone who needed more faces, by someone who is not yet finished. On certain nights, Tuesday nights, which was when Victor Crane traditionally held his rehearsals, the neighbors on the adjacent street report hearing something from the direction of the old building. Voices, multiple voices, the cadences of rehearsed dialogue drifting through the walls of a locked and empty theatre. And beneath it all, very faintly, the sound of an audience, applauding. 3 more. A cave, a kitchen, a theatre. 3 ordinary places made extraordinary by the same quiet insistence that the world does not end at the boundary of the visible, that what has been does not simply cease, that patience, in the end, outlasts everything. I have been thinking, as I so often do in the interval between stories, about what it is that brings you here. You have heard of factories and manors and gardens and forests and caves and kitchens and theatres. You have heard of mirrors that remember and lights that signal and walls that accumulate. You have heard the catalogue of ordinary places twisted by proximity to something older and less comprehensible, into something else entirely. And still you return. I think I understand it finally. You come here not despite the darkness, but because of it. Because there is something in these accounts, something in the slow accumulation of wrongness, in the moment when the beam of the flashlight reaches the far corner and finds it not quite empty, that reminds you of something important. That the light matters, that the act of looking matters, that the alternative of closing the curtains and convincing oneself that the world beyond them is predictable and safe and empty of all that cannot be explained, is, in its own way, the greater darkness. You carry your flashlight into the dark. That is not foolishness. That is the only honest thing any of us can do. This has been Flashlight in the Dark. If tonight's accounts have settled somewhere behind your eyes and refused to leave, if you find yourself in the small hours thinking about caves and kitchens and the sound of applause from an empty theatre, then you know what to do. Leave a like, subscribe, keep the light on for those still finding their way here. And come back soon. I will be waiting.